I want to welcome everyone to Enhancing Energy Equity in Green Building Practices. Before we get started, a huge thanks to our top tier sponsor, Mitsubishi Heating and Air Conditioning. Mitsubishi provides mini splits, is what they're very well known for, right? These little devices, super energy efficient. They heat and they cool at the same time. And hey, if you don't like that look, I understand. You can hide these things up in the wall, on the floor. There's many different opportunities to do that with Mitsubishi. You can also get the best of both worlds and duct the system up in the ceiling and get a little bit of ducts spread throughout the house, not go full on mini split, which still gives you good energy efficiency. Or you can do what I did and what we need to do to millions of existing homes around the world is we need to bring in air source heat pump systems first to act as the air conditioning. It can pair right with the furnace, the gas furnace. And then eventually, like what I did, went 100% electric with Mitsubishi's Hyperheat ducted system. Hey, I'm still alive. It was 6 degrees on Christmas here, and we were staying nice and toasty warm. Hey, and the Inflation Reduction Act is coming out to help you and your clients do this both on on existing homes, and I heard probably new homes as well. The Department of Energy has this great little easy to understand worksheet here showing you how you and your clients at least, are going to get $2,000 for their air source heat pump system. Make sure to check with their tax advisor. And Mitsubishi here has a whole list on which of their products qualify, and they're keeping that list up to date for the Inflation Reduction Act dollars. And this is just for the 25C homes. There's way more things coming out in regards to all the way up to $8,000 for your clients. So you can check more information out that at MitsubishiComfort.com, Inflation Reduction Act. Make sure you hire a diamond contractor. You can contact them to help you install Mitsubishi systems, and you can go to MitsubishiComfort.com to learn more. And thanks to our second tier sponsor, Panasonic Ventilation, helping you stay healthy in your project, helping your clients stay healthy, all the way from supply and exhaust only ventilation up through balanced ventilation, energy recovery ventilation systems, and now smart ventilation, demand controlled ventilation. You can check that out, all their products over at Panasonic.com. All right, well, welcome to, again, Enhancing Energy Equity in Green Building Practices. This course is brought to you by the Green Home Institute. The Green Home Institute is a nonprofit with a mission to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the construction of the places we live. My name is Brett Little, and I will be your moderator today. I am the education manager here. We also have our director, Jose, and program manager, Eliza, who will assist you with other needs if you need to contact our staff. Again, this session, like most others, is approved for multiple continuing education. Apologies there on the FIAS. That is not approved for this session, but we have many that are FIAS approved, as well as AIA, Health, Welfare, and Safety, which may make it applicable to your state-based design or contractor license. And under our Certified Green Home Professional designation, in this case, all 5 pillars of green, you can pick that up. So I am super excited to hand it off to Justin Schott here with the University of Michigan. By no means do we endorse University of Michigan over MSU, over Ohio. We are 100% neutral here, only that we want to invite anyone who wants to speak on our session about anything. I've known Justin from long ago at his days at EcoWorks Detroit, doing some really great work. And so it's exciting to have Justin out here again on our session. And this is part of our environmental justice series, our first session of the year for our environmental justice series, where we recognize that many people do not get access to residential green building opportunities, are ultimately left out, and then aren't invited into the residential green building movement. And we realize that we need better diversity within the residential green building movement because it just makes the movement that much stronger, that much better. So we want to invite everyone to get into it, and we want to ensure all people enjoy greener and healthier homes. So with that, Justin, I hand it off to you, and please take it away. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Brett and the team at the Green Home Institute. It's great to be here with you and to see this national and international crowd that we've got. Just honored that you would make the time to share this space for this webinar, whatever time zone you're in. And I'm really excited to join you. I think this will have a bit of a different flavor, maybe than some of the other webinars, given that it is focused on energy equity and justice and some of those questions about who has been receiving the benefits, right, of energy efficiency and green building, who's been left out, and how we can take a different approach to that. So today I'll be really focusing on the Energy Equity Project framework. And by the framework, I mean 2 parts. We have a report that we issued last summer. It's a pretty dense report, so I'm going to give you some snapshots of what's in there and some guidance on how you can apply that in your own work. And then we have an interactive map. This has 29 national census tract level data sets, and some of these will be familiar, but I think you can do some pretty cool things with that. So I will give you a demonstration, and then you'll be able to work with that live interactive map as well. As we move into it, so I'll give some background just on energy equity, on my personal journey into seeing a lot of these issues firsthand, sharing what's in the framework and how we are approaching energy equity here at U of M, and then getting more into areas that may be, I think, more applicable to you. So specifically thinking about how does energy equity intersect with green building, with thinking about individual households and retrofits. And then we'll think about how we can use data for good, and some of the data that's there in the Energy Equity Project map. I do invite questions, which Brett will be monitoring and fielding. So if you have something either for clarification or something that feels relevant on a slide, please don't feel like you need to hold that until the end. Happy to take breaks and pause and get some more interaction going. Yeah, and I wanted to ask here too, if there's anything else that's up here that you're interested in, particular questions you have about energy equity or justice, would love to just open that up to say this is your session, and I can tailor that as much as possible to your interests. So feel free to share any questions now in the Q&A or the chat just before we get started. So I've got a sense of where your interests lie. All right, so while you're thinking about that, I'm gonna jump in, share a little bit more background. This work started here at U of M, going back to an ACEEE summer session in 2018, where Dr. Tony Reams, who I know some of you know, and who's now working with DOE as the senior advisor on energy justice, he and a number of colleagues from this advisory team got together and realized that the approach to energy equity was pretty haphazard. There wasn't a standardized framework or way to do this. And so it was kind of anybody's best guess to define energy equity. That could mean affordability. That could mean thinking about health benefits in homes. That could mean carbon reductions. It was kind of all over the place. And so that meant when there were proposals of how to spend money or how to spend or design utility efficiency programs, right? We didn't know what was good, what wasn't, how to really think about that. So that was the goal of this getting together. This work is now led by Dr. Kyle White, who is also a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, while Dr. Reams is on leave. And this is a photo of my work before coming to U of M. So I spent over a decade working in Detroit, primarily working with young people and also with residents to think about how we can both tackle some of the energy affordability issues, that are really endemic in Detroit and places like Flint, but also how this can be a pathway into green jobs for young people, how we can start to capture some of the other benefits. So this is one of the crews working in Flint that we had actually for a while with consumers. But I ran a program where we had young people doing basic home energy retrofits in Detroit. We were out to something like 13,000 homes over the 6 years that I was working on that program before leading EcoWorks and getting more involved in these structural questions of why do we still have these energy inequities? What does it take to get at the real root causes of them? This is just a note on the framework. So in addition to that team of advisors, to Dr. Reams and Dr. White, we had about 45 people from across a range of sectors, from regulators to public agencies to grassroots environmental justice organizations, all coming together over the course of more than a year to develop this framework. So I'm incredibly grateful to them, and I think it reflects just the diversity of perspectives and backgrounds that we had feeding into the work. So again, we came into this in 2018. There wasn't a standard way of approaching equity within energy programs or ensuring that it would be an equitable energy transition. We know that up until this point, right, most of the benefits of energy efficiency and clean energy have gone primarily to whiter and wealthier households, not by intention necessarily, but those are just the folks that have had access from everything to financing and the ability to make improvements on their own, to advertising and qualified contractors in their neighborhoods, to being able to take advantage of tax credits. So that's just the nature of this. It's not a value judgment. It's just a recognition of the starting point. Brett, yeah.
Well, and it sounds like you're kind of maybe getting into the answer to this question, but the specific question is, what entry-level information is important for disadvantaged communities to understand so they can better engage with energy efficiency and working with the contractors in selecting, appliances and systems.
Yeah. So I think, for the most part, this is changing. So I first want to just say, from all of the polling research that's out there, we see just as strong an interest in energy efficiency and in clean energy, regardless of income, regardless of race, right? People all over care about this. So it's not that people have different priorities. We'll see in a couple of slides, right, that utility affordability is crucial, but it's not just affordability. And this is one of the things that I learned just going into homes. And, I was out to about 100 home energy visits with high school students. And I realized as we were in conversation with people, sometimes I remember one home being out with a retired pastor who was 101 and really needed to keep the house especially warm because she was frail and just very sensitive to the cold, but had terribly leaky doors and windows. But we hear these older stories and we get a sense for what people care about. And regardless of the economic struggles that people have, they still care about climate change. They still care about clean air. They still care about the health benefits, the jobs benefits for the current generation of students, right? So I think it's really important to note that even though access may be different, it's not really that the priorities or the values here are different. And so there is this big barrier, right, of people may think these programs aren't for me, I can't afford them. The only program that I can go to is weatherization through a community action agency, and that's got a 2-year waiting list. And maybe I didn't get in last time because I had a wiring issue, right? And that ended up in disqualifying me. So I think just being able to return to people in these conversations and to really emphasize in our communications, in our promotional materials, right, that these programs for energy efficiency are specifically for people that may have been underserved or marginalized in the past. So I hope that gets to that question. I think it's a really great one to be discussing. And I think this does get to it, right? So in creating this framework, we're using really neutral data. It's an objective, robust, research-driven process. And yet we know that in creating this framework, we're hoping to raise awareness and actually shift the outcomes so that they are benefiting Black and Brown communities, lower income communities, and communities on the front lines of environmental injustice. So in terms of the applications of the framework, there are a number of different scales for this. Anything from federal policy and Justice 40 and trying to really hold some accountability there and make sure that this is happening and that communities have the resources they need to say, okay, this is the energy future that we want to see. And we provide them with data about their own communities so that they can start to draft those energy plans, submit their own proposals to DOE and other agencies that'll bring in that energy future. We also think a lot of this is about shifting our mindset. So often I've seen people approach energy equity issues as zero sum, right? There's going to be some winner and some loser. I don't think that's necessarily the case. So we can change the questions or the starting point that we're asking. And then, we've been in this energy system with the grid, with primarily monopoly, investor-owned utilities for many decades, right? And that's done harm to certain communities. And I think we need to recognize that and to think about ways that we will shift away from that and ensure that those harms are no longer concentrated in frontline communities. So I think this may be familiar to people. Some of it is still a little shocking to me. So I'm going to just run through a little bit of background of where we are, and in particular, where BIPOC and frontline communities are with energy equity issues. So my experience, this is consistent with polls that we've done in Detroit as well that are looking at where utility affordability comes in terms of people's just day-to-day concerns. And it's number 2 here. It was the same in Detroit. Affordable housing was tops, followed by the ability or the inability for people to afford their utilities, not just energy, but water as well. I think it's really powerful that this comes in above the need for food assistance. And some of that is about the strength of the safety net, right? We have, in general, more areas are better resourced to provide food assistance. And then we see things like childcare, medical assistance, transportation. This is way down the list of people's top concerns. So, if people aren't getting this message, if you're talking to decision makers, we do have data that the ability for people just to afford their utilities is a top concern for their households overall. At the same time, leading up to COVID, before we had any utility shutoff moratoria, we were seeing increasingly punitive policies for people who weren't able to afford utilities. This is a California example. We can see, about tripling of the rate of shutoffs over a 5-year period there. There's not any reason that people will be becoming 3 times as unable to afford their bills, right? This was a collection tactic that utilities were using. And it's not just California where we see this. I think this is the approach of many states and many utilities. In many places, it's the regulations on shutoffs are pretty limited, right? We have some that, in most extreme weather cases or people with a chronic medical condition will have some shutoffs. But just in the last year or so, our best estimates from the data we have are there were about 3.5 million shutoffs of energy across the US. So this is a pretty serious problem that we're facing. And one that's increasing, and we saw shutoffs ramp up as soon as many of those moratoria ended. This does disproportionately impact people by race. So you can see half of all Black and brown households are facing some form of energy insecurity. So energy insecurity can mean keeping the house at an unsafe temperature, receiving a shutoff notice, actually being disconnected, or shifting away between other critical basic needs, right? So foregoing medicines, food to make a utility payment or rent payment, and then coming back. Yeah, Brett.
If I understand right, EIA has updated their energy surveys for 2020, I think. Maybe this was the latest one, but I know I'm getting pretty geeked out to find that. Do you know if some these sort of data will be updated with that, or have you seen anything?
Yeah, so this is this has been an issue. I think this is only a sampling of something like 12 or 15 states that were included here. So we have a number that are left out. And then I don't believe they've released this. So this was started like in 2020, but the last that I had checked in late 2022, it was not fully released, right? So clearly an 8-year window for updating this is not helpful. We do have some data though from the Census Pulse survey, which was started in response to the pandemic, and that was conducted every 2 weeks. So I'm gonna show you some of that data in a minute here.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this is more broadly just looking at racial disparities. California has a specific EJ screen tool or CalEnviro screen. Michigan now has the My EJ screen tool. We've got national EJ screen as well. But I think hopefully these two rings provide a pretty clear visual of what's happening, right? So white households, for the most part, are living in the cleaner neighborhoods. And if you are a person of color, you are much, much more likely, right, to live in some of the most polluted and most impacted neighborhoods. And again, this pattern is well documented in California, but it's certainly replicated in other states. So this is that more recent Pulse survey data that I mentioned, Brett. It's from winter of 2021 into 2022. And this is work that's done by Indiana's Energy Justice Lab. And again, we see those same patterns. The numbers may be a little bit different, but this is looking at different forms of energy insecurity, from the inability to pay a bill to actually being disconnected. So in just a 3-month period, right, we can see the disconnection rates are significantly higher among the Black and Latinx community. And then the other, which may be multiple races, Native communities, right, that's even higher, about double what it is among white households. So we talk a lot about impacts by race and impacts by income, but I think something we don't focus on enough is that children are bearing the brunt of shutoffs. This is particularly heartbreaking to me when I think back to my time in Detroit and being in homes where there may have been a recent shutoff, or people sharing a shutoff notice and not knowing how they were going to avoid that, right? Households with children under 5, nearly 30% of them in just this one winter, right, experienced a shutoff. And this is for this period from November through January, so the coldest times. So that's something to be thinking about, I think. How can we be doing outreach better to households with children, especially, I would say, single parent households are extremely vulnerable to energy insecurity. So when we think about the kinds of support and the security net that's available to people for energy, this may have changed a little bit. This was ACEEE data, this was sourced in an ACEEE report from 2016, right? But that shows 80% of what's available to people is still in bill assistance. And we all know, as green building professionals, right, this is not what needs to happen. This is not breaking the cycle of energy insecurity and energy poverty. But I think it's something that we have a responsibility and an opportunity to be advocating for. How do we really start to broaden the pie here for these other sectors, right? Because we know this isn't cutting it. My dream is that we put ourselves out of a job because everybody has super efficient, affordable energy and affordable housing. And we are nowhere near that. And we are just continuing to cycle money. I saw LIHEAP just got a big increase in funding, I think, to $6 billion. So we need to do a better job capturing this in the efficiency and clean energy space.
Justin, can you just, whether you spell out what LIHEAP means, or just, again, for those who do not know, briefly remind us what LIHEAP is?
Yeah, it's the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and this is federal taxpayer funded. It's distributed by formula, so it's based really on the climate and the population of states. So Michigan historically, I think, has had something like 220, 230 million per year coming in. And I believe people have to be below 150% of the poverty level to qualify.
Yeah. And one thing that I just really want to point out on this chart that I'm seeing and is very powerful here is that the bottom there, right? The 41% ratepayer and the 40% LIHEAP, right? 81%, that is what I look at as reactive, right? Reacting to a problem. Whereas I see WAP, weatherization assistance, LIHEAP for efficiency and rate funded efficiency, that's a very that's only like 14% as the sort of proactive approach, right? I mean, is that kind of how it is?
Yeah.
It looks like it's just paying people's energy bills after they've needed help is what I'm seeing here.
Exactly, right. And some of these, right, LIHEAP is a little harder to influence because that's in federal statute, right? So we don't have as much control there. But we do have the Public Service Commission and DHHS in Michigan, for instance, that do collect ratepayer funds, right? So this is something I've tried to organize around to get people to say we need to spend more of this on energy efficiency. And I've gotten pushback from state officials on that over multiple years, despite having strong coalitions of partners behind it. So yeah, lots of work to be done here. That case should be a no-brainer, right? And there's no dignity behind having to go back for assistance year after year after year. And if there are people that are doing this 5 years in a row, 7 years, right? By that point, we could have just paid for that heat pump that you were talking about, Brett.
Absolutely. And thanks for, pointing out the work you've been doing here. And I did want to let everyone know last year we did a webinar on accessing national existing home energy efficiency programs. Basically, a lot of people don't understand the WAP program. So those of you who missed that, I'm just posting a link into the chat about that and how you can get involved with those programs wherever you are. So thanks, Justin.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say, Michigan, as much as I've kept up with it, I think is trying to do a better job to leverage weatherization in putting some of those ratepayer funds into health and safety programs. And those are enabling people to get past some of those deferral issues that they're facing.
Yeah, I hope we get some more news on that tonight too. So
nice. Right. And then I think just to kind of put a pin on that, this was an analysis from Minnesota and just asking the question at our current pace for weatherization, right? Not for bill assistance. We are looking at another 3 centuries, right? So more than we've had an American government officially before we would get everybody weatherized, well longer than the lifespan of these homes. And this just doesn't cut it. I don't know what the right time frame is before we say everybody needs to be weatherized or have major retrofits done. There's some dose of reality, I think, that we need to take into account here, right? But I think many of us would advocate for at least 10 times faster, if not 20 times faster than this current pace would be more in line with what we need, both for community benefits and for climate as well. All right, I'm going to shift gears. That's just our starting point, what we know the issues are in the system, and move to how the Energy Equity Project was thinking about energy equity and how we define it. And then I'll walk through some of what's in the framework and how you can use that as well. Right, so we see a lot of terms that are out there. There's affordability, there's access, democracy and justice, you may see, right? So people seeking to really own the generation of their energy systems. And so we thought it was really important to just spell out how we're thinking about energy equity. And throughout the report, we're using what we reference as the 4 pillars of energy equity. This comes out of both the work of EJ organizations as well as in the academic literature. And so these are recognition, which you'll sometimes hear called structural. This is about demographics, procedural, which is about both, I think, access to programs as well as access to decision-making. We have distributive, which is about the benefits and the burdens. And then Restorative often gets less focus. I like to think of restorative as kind of the overarching umbrella that we need to pay attention to. So if we're lacking in any of those other three dimensions, say we have a program that distributes benefits equitably, but people had no say in the design of that program from a procedural standpoint, we would say that's probably failing overall, right? So just like a car, we can't have three wheels spinning okay and a fourth one, pointing in a different direction. I would say the same applies to energy equity. So these are the questions. So recognition, again, is about who, procedural, about people's voice and ability to influence decision-making, distributive, burdens and benefits, and then restorative, how did we get here? How can we make sure the future looks different? So I'm going to run through just some examples to make these a little bit more tangible. So starting with distributional justice, right? And I think this is often where we think, okay, who's getting the heat pumps? And we have some documentation of this. This data is from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Now, some of these have come down, I think, since this was reported, I believe, in 2016. And we actually have this data by census-tract on the median income of solar installers. So I'll share that with you. But for the most part, right, when we think about who's getting solar, who's getting EVs, right, these are our usual suspects that, of course, wealth is going to be what separates the people that are receiving the benefits from those that have not. And in some cases, right, we know people really don't need these tax credits. I think they would be likely to adopt EVs regardless. And yet the caps on some of these, right, I think for households where you have two earners, the caps now for electric vehicles are up to $400,000 in income, right? And then we've got just a $4,000 tax credit for buying a used EV if you can find one through a dealer, and if you have a tax burden at all, at least in this current year. So we've got a lot of issues there. Some thoughts about what this could look like in our own program design. Right, I think often when we look at the portfolios of low-income programs, advocates are consistently seeing that a lot of this is going into things like education, which I really value, but it's not the same as doing a deep retrofit for people. Things like lighting and changing water fixtures, right? These are not going to dramatically shift people's bills and permanently stabilize energy affordability for them. And they're not always necessarily aligned with health and safety, right? So a lighting benefit doesn't have those same benefits that we have if we are electrifying somebody's cooking, for instance. So I think we need to really be thinking about these. And every time we see a planned program investment with ratepayer funds, right, these are some of the questions that we can bring around distributional justice. So recognition justice, again, this is about who and different populations. And I think this is really important to help us guide some of our program targeting and our program design, right? So I showed that slide about children being particularly affected. To me, that says we are not nearly doing enough to meet single mothers in particular where they are, and making sure that they know that these programs are available, that they are for them, being able to represent them in program literature so that they see themselves there, helping them get the information in whatever spaces and communities that they're at, right? And I think if you look at most, at least in DTE territory, when I'm looking at ads for different programs, I'm often seeing this around homes that clearly look like they're homeowners in the suburbs, right? It doesn't necessarily focus on outreach to renters, outreach to people that may have barriers to accessing programs. This is something that we tried to model in the Energy Equity Project, right? So this is voluntary for people, but we're asking people just to tell us who they are and making sure that they are comfortable with us being transparent about that, right? So when you're looking at this framework, you may be thinking, oh, these were all EJ people that put it together. That's not the case, right? You can see here, and that I think changes your evaluation potentially when you know what participation looks like. And the same goes for energy programs. We ask people for data on race as well, so that we can be transparent there. I think, often I've heard utilities say, oh, we can't collect that data. That's not really the case. You can ask, you can't compel people to share this data. But I think this gives power to whether we are improving or whether we're walking backward, right? And so even if we're not getting universal responses from people, we can still see the trends just in collecting data voluntarily. Same thing goes for gender. I think this was a really cool part about the Energy Equity Project, that it was 85% women-led here, and all of our lead authors were women as well. So that was recognition and distribution. And I want to just touch briefly on Justice 40, because we're going to be seeing more and more of this, and states thinking about how they do this as well. So Justice 40 is really bringing together both a recognition element, which is that 29% of the population that's disadvantaged on one hand, and then the distributional component is that 40% of the benefits need to flow to that 29%, right? So it's a little higher than proportional, but not dramatically so. And then you've still got the communities that are not disadvantaged, 71% of the population that's in line to receive something like 60% of the benefits. And I think this is where it's so important to say that Justice 40 is a floor, it's not a ceiling. So, what would that look like if instead of 40%, we were thinking about, 50% or 70% of the benefits going to disadvantaged communities? There's nothing that's stopping states from doing that. The other thing, this image here, right, just treats people in one of two classes, which is a really crude way to go about it. If you think about, let's say, home retrofits, either you could get package A, right, or you could get nothing. We know we need much more customization than that. And so we can be thinking about how we're allocating benefits, right? Maybe this top decile, like the tracts that we saw in California that were majority BIPOC, right? Maybe we want to really focus on making sure that they are getting a heavy chunk of the benefits. So 25% here on the right could go to that most disadvantaged decile. And then we can work down, right? So I think we can start to get a little bit more granular working with our data, and not just having these kind of binary thresholds of, do people qualify or do they not, right? And Tony Reams at U of M has done work looking at this, what he calls the donut hole of financing. So people that don't qualify for weatherization, they also probably don't have the credit they need to do their own financing. And these are people that tend to be in the like 200 to 400% of federal poverty level, or in that like 80 to 120% of AMI. They get skipped over a lot by programs. And there's this assumption that they can either get assistance or they can get financing. And there's this whole group of people in the middle that doesn't apply to. So there's a lot more I think we can do by getting more specific with our data. This is another look at it. I'm not going to get too much into this because I think it's a little overwhelming. But again, the further right we go, the more of the benefits that we're concentrating in the communities of greatest need. And then the last thing, sorry, this is a little fuzzy here, that I hear about is procedural justice. And this is a hard one, right? I think I hear from people, well, we invite communities to come out to these meetings and nobody shows up. What's with that, or what else can I do? And I will be the first to tell you it's absolutely hard. Sometimes you can have the best efforts there and you won't have anything to show for it. And that can be really disheartening. That's been my experience in Detroit, right? You can plan these great meetings. You can set them up with food and entertainment and think everything's going to be great. And then, I don't know, maybe you get a day like today where it's snowing and people can't get there, or there's something else going on, right? Tons of competing interests. So it's really hard work. I would say don't get discouraged. I do think the framing, making these culturally appropriate and relevant, if you were in a predominantly Black community, having Black people represented in these invitations, right, is critical. And this is work from what I would say is a model campaign in Georgia. If you go check out Georgia Conservation Voters, they're doing this outreach really well. And, it's rooted in ongoing relationships and organizing. So if we are, let's say, trying to get people to weigh in on programs every 2 years, right? Let's say there's a new energy efficiency plan from DTE or another utility every 2 years. It's really hard to just be in touch for that one point in time if we don't have existing relationships. And so I think my biggest piece of advice here is just continue to be in touch with community partners, whether or not you have something to offer. It may feel strange to just reach out and say, hey, let's catch up, without trying to ask for anything, without anything to offer. But I think that's how we get more success on the procedural end. These are a couple of images from meetings around the Detroit Sustainability Plan. So we had local artists that were there on site. Again, focusing on parents and lifting up their experiences, making sure children are represented in the space. There was childcare. And I think these make an enormous difference to people feeling welcome. And it's not always easy to do. We need the budget for it. We need to plan. This was planned, I think, with the Radical Childcare Collective, right? So there are lots of ways that we need to make this fit with people's lives rather than trying to bring people in and say, hey, you need to fit in this particular opening that I have. There's some simpler things we can do. This is just some live polling that we did with listening sessions for the Energy Equity Project. We reached about 400 people over 10 listening sessions. So, we wanted to get this framework together, but we didn't want to race through this. And this was incredibly valuable in helping us know what data was a priority to people and which ones we could just let go. We thought transportation, for instance, here might be a really strong interest. It turns out that it wasn't. And so we didn't really try to pursue this as much as we could have. So sometimes the data from community outreach can free you from doing extra unnecessary work that may not get used. Right. And then in the framework itself, we are reporting back the results of those polls so that anybody can see, okay, here's the justification, again, for why you didn't support transportation burdens. We show how they were valued by different stakeholders at the top left, right? So if there was a big difference between utilities or practitioners, we note that as well. And then the last thing that I wanted to share from our process, we spent a lot of times on norms. You can imagine bringing in grassroots activists and utility folks, not always the smoothest. And so we had some confrontations there, and we wanted to just take some time to get norms together. Everything from what people said, I absolutely need this, this is non-negotiable, to others that were more aspirational in this kind of no fear category in the bottom right. And with 45 people using Jamboard, we got a ton of responses there. And then we're able to come back and have some discussion around how we would operate. So this is, giving people control of the process, I think is really valuable here as well. I'm gonna move through this. I think we've talked about it. I do think tracking who's participating is really critical, right? And being able to report back. So in the same way, collecting data on race, on income, were these people with kids who are coming? These are things that we want to do when we're reporting on our community engagement efforts. And then compensation, right? Michigan is really fortunate or savvy, I would say, to have this intervenor compensation so that we do have a variety of community groups and not just national environmental groups, real community groups that are doing organizing, that are able to fund that work, to fund legal assistance so that they can be there at the table, submitting official testimony, providing witnesses, doing their own cross-examinations, as part of the MPSC dockets. So we do have dedicated funding. Michigan, I think, is one of just 6 states that has active intervenor compensation program. Going to walk through some of what's inside with the framework briefly. So you'll find there's a chapter for each of the 4 dimensions. They break down into indices. They spend a lot of time on guiding principles. So even if we don't have the perfect data here, right, if we say one of our guiding principles is that nobody has a severe energy burden above 10%, we can always be working toward that, even in the absence of data. So this is a summary. It's too much to read here, but I will drop the link so you can check out the framework. Right, again, I think principles are critical. There's so much that's changing now. And so this deeper grounding in energy equity is really what we need to move forward. We can use tools, but we are not going to have a perfect playbook for every moment because so much is evolving now, right? And so I think if we understand how do we think about the people or that recognition dimension, how do we think about procedural justice and how we're making access or making space at decision-making tables, and then the distribution of benefits and burdens. Just using those 3 approaches, right, we can ask the right questions regardless of the program. So you'll see those principles, which I think are really thoughtful. The working group spent a lot of time coming up with these. You'll see each of the different metrics, and there's a lot of guidance on those. So some of these, right, will give you snapshots, will tell you where the data is sourced from and how to implement it or how it's being used in different states and different communities. This is from the Restorative Justice work group. So this may have some interesting pieces for you, thinking about Indigenous sovereignty, traditional knowledge, what is the land that we occupy now? I'm here on Anishinaabe lands that the University of Michigan sits on. So there's some more, I don't want to call this radical because I don't think it should be seen as radical, but some new ideas that are presented in that chapter. And then in terms of the data, so we looked at nearly 150 potential measures and we categorized all of these. We do have all of this that's publicly available. So again, 29 made it into the final framework. Most of those are recognition variables or things having to do with demographics. We have a number of priority data gaps. Shutoffs were the biggest one. And then we've got some that are shifting to a best practice. We don't think we'll ever have data to work with that. And others, particularly for like public utility commissions, where there's a desire to create a rating scale. So each of those is written up. You'll find detail about the geographic resolution, what dimension they apply to, and then the status of all of these in the framework. We've got some guidance on equity planning, starting with how do you just have conversations at your workplace or in your community using some equity prompts. So a lot of kind of process work to happen before we think about setting equity targets and metrics. We focus on different considerations for different types of users and applying those to the different dimensions. And then we've got some planning templates for you. I will say, please, see us as a resource. I'll share my contact. But if you're interested in digging into this work, we'll be launching communities of practice soon. Those are free to participate in. And then lastly, there's some information, again, getting back to transparency. We wanted to be really clear on how this framework came together. And we are working on better user guides, thinking about how we get this into other languages, making it more accessible for community members. So I'm going to pause there and just do a time check here. So happy to have any discussion or take questions about the framework itself. And then I think actually just jumping into data and the map might be the best way to wrap before we do more Q&A. How does that sound, Brett?
Yeah, go ahead and do that, yeah.
Okay. And this next exercise, everything's there in the slides if you're interested in that. So I'm just gonna pull up our map here and drop the link in chat. So this is the map that I'll be working in. All right. So this is something that we developed with a couple of partners, Earthrise and Shift7. And so we've got all of our data sets listed here in this dropdown. And then the other thing that we have is sliders, right? So you can see in real time, this is about what we'll see, anything from 1 to 20% as the census tract level energy burdens. It's been really difficult to figure out how to square changing resolutions from county to census tracts. But when we come down, right, we can look at an individual census tract and then get all of the data there. So this census tract, right, almost entirely Black, it's in Detroit. We can see, right, everything from education, the home energy affordability gap that says this household is spending $1,278 more than a 6% energy burden. Really limited internet access here. It's got a lot of seniors living alone, a lot of renters, right? So all of that data, a lot of single parent households here. So this is all available for any individual tract. And the energy burden here, again, right, 19% in this tract in Detroit. So you can do that sort of analysis. The other thing that we've been really working on is comparing two. So we might look at, for instance, let's take heat wave risk. And then we can start to, again, filter and say, okay, where is that most significant? So here in the heartland, but we can add another filter too. So we might say, okay, heat waves are particularly threatening to seniors who are living alone. And so we can add another filter in the second dimension in order to do that and to zoom in on where this is a problem. Again, if you're looking at urban areas, you really have to get zoomed in. And this is a bug that we are working on. So, you know, we know St. Louis has a big issue with heat exposure and high percentages of seniors living alone in some of these tracts. You won't see that at the outset. So just a caution, that's where we are. We're kind of in beta format here. We do have the methodology and the data sources that you can check out here. Descriptions of everything that's in the map and how it was developed. And then I'm going to just share in GitHub, right? We have a pipeline if you want to download all of our data. So you'll see every single census tract as its own row with those 29 variables. That's really useful for running your own analyses. And then we've got some insights. So we've been looking at things here where you'll see some of our work if you scroll down beyond the code, right? This is in California, looking for tracts where there's a high percentage of people with a disability, high energy burden, and a high percentage of seniors alone, right? And where those are overlapping. So we know, especially in Imperial Valley in California, right? These are some of the areas where we have top vulnerability among all of those three variables. So that's some of the work that we're starting to do. But this is work, again, that you can do on your own by setting filters with our original data. And then we've got a summary of all of those 148 potential metrics that we looked at, the work group ratings, and then a description and where the data is sourced from, and any other details here. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to come back into this segment in the discussion space.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And just real quick before we jump into the rest of this session and get into the Q&A, I just want to thank everyone for joining us and remind you that you can rewatch this session if you missed some of it, share it with your colleagues, or whatever you'd like to do at our YouTube channel at greenhomeinstitute.org. You can subscribe there and get an instant update when it's available. For those of you watching this in the future on demand, not live here today, if you want your continuing ed certificate, please take the quiz with an 80% passing rate. You can find that quiz on our USGBC channel, Thinkific channel, or whatever future channel this may be showing up on. And again, before we head out, as long as you've been appropriately logged in through Zoom and you've been here through the CEU 50-minute CEU hour, you are approved and dismissed if you need to get going, but we hope you'll stick around for questions. And make sure to check certs at gutenbergcerts.com. It'll be sent to your spam there. Go ahead and mark that as safe and you'll get your certificate. And before we get into all those questions coming up, a huge thanks to our top tier sponsors like Mitsubishi Heating and Cooling, which has multiple Inflation Reduction Act funds coming your way to help you there, April Air, and many of our other sponsors who support the work we do, as well as our nearly 300 members, and our executive director, Jose Reyna, and our board of directors and all of our volunteers. Thanks to them for allowing us to do what we do. Yeah, Justin, so, that map, I think, took us all by surprise, a good surprise. I saw a lot of comments coming in of how cool that was. I certainly did not understand how robust U of M had put together something like that. So it's very great to see. I'm curious to what extent this kind of information will be updated. I know these kinds of things are snapshots in time. Things change, life changes. Is this going to be a place that people can continue to come back to get updated information?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that feedback. I'm glad this is interesting to people. So we do have APIs set up for most of the census data. So as soon as there is a new data set, that's getting pulled right into the map. So it's as close to real time as we can make it. And we do have a dedicated data scientist to maintain the map and the data sets as well. I also don't think this is the final list. So if you have other leads on data, we're very interested in that. And then it's pretty easy just in Excel. If you have state data or county data, you can just add a column and then be able to, as long as you match that with the census tract IDs, then you can work with that as well. So you can actually build out that baseline data that we have for your own uses.
So you're speaking about adding things and putting things in. I was also pleasantly surprised to see climate risks like heat wave being mentioned. What other climate risks do you have in there? And again, I guess the same kind of question. We understand climate risks are sort of a changing, right? Day by day, we're learning more. So I assume those kinds of things are being, updated.
Yeah. So the climate risks we have are heat waves, wildfires, and hurricanes right now. So the kind of climate, severe precipitation events, I guess, are what they would say for Michigan. We don't have those reflected, unfortunately. And we know, right, so many of these, I think, are optimistic. So these are FEMA data sets, right? I don't think Portland is going to show up as a heat wave ground zero, even though, right, I guess it was 2 summers ago that heat wave was really deadly there, right? We had, I think, a couple hundred deaths in the Portland area because of that. And so I think they're always an underestimate. That's FEMA. And then the data sources, I've done some looking. They combine like building losses, population losses, and agricultural losses typically. And so this is a combined risk assessment. And some of it, as we're ground truthing, will make sense. But I think other areas will be just missed in models, right? So like there are places in North Dakota that have the same building loss risk as like in metropolitan Boston or New York. It's kind of hard to see how that is, right? And a lot of this is like, there's some underlying assumptions in models that may or may not make sense at a really local level.
Well, I posted a link in the chat there for those interested in climate risk assessments. We did a session with enterprise community partners on Portfolio Protect. So hopefully, Justin, I'd encourage you all to sync up with them and what they're doing and maybe there's a way you can align. But anyway, that's
yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for that.
Yeah, just an idea. So a question came in, and then you kind of started answering it as you showed the map, which was very helpful. That what kind of ideas and assistance are there for rural communities? Clearly, you've got those covered here, at least in the evaluation side. But what are some of the differences maybe approaching rural communities when you try to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I think I just want to note, I think this question is really valuable. And I know the CGEST tool, right, which is from the Council on Environmental Quality for Justice 40 and identifying disadvantaged communities. That tool was notoriously missing rural states and communities and was just underrepresenting them with the data sets that were selected. So things like transportation burden, right, which we know are particularly rough in rural communities. That's not something that we have identified here. So I don't have a great solution other than, I think, yes, generally, I would say rural communities are underrepresented. We also tend to have more data gaps from rural communities in just less populated areas with data collection that can be harder. So yeah, it's a big issue. And I think, right, in using data in general, it's the baseline, but it doesn't trump people's lived experiences or what we hear from communities themselves. And so I think it's like, here's something that we can look to as a guide, but when we know other things, right, that form of knowledge that we're hearing about issues that rural communities have or the need for energy investments there, that needs to be held on the same or even a higher plane, I would say, than what we get from data sets.
What was the other question? So kind of going back to evaluating homes, I think the question was really specific to the deferrals in the Weatherization Action Assistance Program. So a lot of times, for those of you who don't know, there's funding all across the country available for people, no matter where they're at, for low-income energy efficiency. But many times those folks kind of get thrown out of the program, kind of like you were mentioning, right? If people don't qualify for programs, it's assumed that they can just pay for it out of pocket, which is really ridiculous, right? Well, this is a more niched version of that issue where, let's say they do qualify for the program, but someone comes in and finds that they have a roof leak. And I'm saying this to the audience. I know you know this, Justin, but they have a roof leak or a plumbing issue or a lead or asbestos issue. Then again, they're just tossed right out of the program, and they just assume that they'll just go and buy a new roof, which is, again, just quite ridiculous. So the question kind of being asked here is, what thoughts are there when these, what we call deferrals, do come up? There was a question that said get around them. I would certainly not recommend getting around anything. You wouldn't want to, improve a home with lead in it or asbestos and cause health issues. But how do you find, ways and means to, cover those costs? What have you seen? Because I know it seems like most programs, what I've noticed, just want to pay for the efficiency, right? They get the carbon offset or whatever. It's really cool. It's really trendy, but nobody wants to pay for the asbestos removal, right? It's not very fun, So what have you seen, or what are your thoughts, kind of on that concern there?
Yeah. So I'll speak to Michigan, which I know better. And, this was seen, so the weatherization side, right, that's the federal funding that the community action agencies are implementing. But then we have the ratepayer energy efficiency dollars through utilities like DTE. And advocates were asking that DTE programs also do some of the health and safety issues, not only to qualify for those energy efficiency programs, but to make them eligible for weatherization specifically. So that started, I think, with a $5 million budget as a pilot. And I don't know what our total weatherization budget is, but I would think that, maybe one approach is here's a percentage, right, of the some total budget. If it can't be from weatherization, because that's got federal limitations, let's think about maybe it is 5% of the residential portfolio needs to just be for health and safety upgrades, even if those are not contributing, right, to the energy savings target that we have. Oh, you're muted, Brett.
So obviously we have a lot of folks who tune in from around the world. So welcome to everyone who's not in the United States. What kind of thoughts can you share, or do you all plan to do any further research, outside of the US on these issues?
I think it's very different, right? If we're talking about energy affordability versus fundamental access to energy, which is the issue that we see in much of the global South. I think one of our roles here is to push back on narratives that pit decarbonization against increasing access to energy, right? And so I think I've read just giving everybody in sub-Saharan Africa access to energy, which is like 800 million people who currently do not have access, is like a 1 or 2% increase in the global carbon footprint. And it's like the same usage per person as like a second refrigerator for most Americans. So, I think just pushing back on these ideas, right, that are often punishing, I think, to people in other countries when they, again, we know are like virtually not on the radar for their lifetime carbon emissions or contribution to, climate change. So I think just trying to really reframe the equity and the justice issues there. I don't know that we have a particular tool or, piece of the framework that can support that work.
So there was a sudden flood of questions and comments that came in around solar power. And again, to be clear, we certainly want to reduce energy first, just so everyone's aware of that, which improves comfort and health. Certainly, solar panels do not improve comfort or health. And then, we want to electrify to the extent that we can. And then it makes sense to go solar. But what kind of benefits or opportunities or barriers are there, for solar power? I know, for example, like in Michigan, sadly, in most of our big utilities, people cannot benefit from community solar. Maybe that's one of the answers. I see that, but what are your thoughts on that? Is solar play a role, or are we still trying to work on efficiency and even electrification before we can talk about renewables?
Yeah, I appreciate your point on community solar, and I think it makes a lot more sense, or community choice aggregation and being able to procure locally seems much better. I was just doing some reading about California and some of the solar power that they're not able to put onto the grid. I think they were calling it curtailment on days when there's too many electrons, right, to really feed into all of the demand. But that makes a lot more sense locally when we're able to do that through local distribution to be able to tap into that. So I think some of that, planning for community scale resilience, community scale, right, EV charging to try to balance some of the demand, charging and EVs as storage. I think there's so much that's really interesting. And like so many of these things, I think, if people wait until technology is fully mature, right, then we've already set up like the people that can capture the early benefits. So I guess that's the one thing that I would say is I totally agree with you at the household level. Weatherization and electrification is still where it's at. But communities should be starting to plan and make these investments, especially while we've got federal funding.
Well, great, Justin. I know we are at our time here, and I don't see any other specific questions. But should anybody have any questions or want to contact you all to learn more or stay up to date with what you're doing, where can they go to do that?
Yeah, let's be in community. Thanks for posting that closing slide. But again, you've got it in the chat, and feel free to send that around. And we'll have a mix of opportunities. So some will be more kind of public sessions about how to use the framework, how to set equity targets and develop metrics. And others, feel free to just reach out individually if you've got a question or something that we can be a resource for.
Great. Justin Schott, project manager, University of Michigan with the Energy Equity Project, energyequityproject.com. Justin, it was really great to see you out there virtually anyway. I hope to see you in person here soon. And look forward to seeing all the work you all are doing there and staying in touch. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Brad, and to this great audience. I had a blast.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a good week. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Be sure to check out all of our courses available online that you can watch anytime and anywhere to pick up your CEUs. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube to get weekly updates and stay up to date on green building science courses, webinars, and home tours. Thanks again.